Hello everyone. In this video we are going to see the age of Tennyson from 1832 to 1887 verse. What following are methods of division we here call the age of Tennyson corresponds very closely as a period of literature with the Victorian age in general history. So Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 and it was during the decade between 1830 and 1840 that many of the writers who were to add special distinction to her reign began their work. But though her own life extended till 1901, we may conveniently take the year of her jubilee 1887 as marking the close of this last epoch in our survey. By the time, a fresh race in literature had arisen, while those of the former generation who still survived had nothing of importance to add to their protection. And indeed, like Tennyson's Bedivere, found themselves among new men, strange faces, other minds. Wonderfully rich and varied in personal quality, and its astonishing variety is one of its outstanding characteristics. So, the literature of the age of Tennyson at the same time everywhere embodies the spirit of Victorian England, and it reflects the influences which combined to make the half century in question an era of surprising change along many lines. It is such a literature as in the mass could not conceivably have been produced at any other time in the world's history. So, the enormous complexity of the period and bewildering diversity of the elements which entered into its civilization render exhaustive analysis within brief limits impossible. But it is but it is fortunately not difficult to indicate the two great dominant movements or main currents as brands would call them in the general life of the term. They are in the political and social spheres the progress of democracy, in the intellectual sphere the progress of science. So reference has been made to the conservative reaction which followed the excitement of the French Revolution. By 1837, that reaction had practically spent its force as well in England as on the continent. So the Reform Bill of 1832, it had already destroyed the political supremacy of the landed aristocracy, but as it left the greater part of the laboring classes still unenfranchised. It did not satisfy those who had pressed for and been led to expect a far more radical measure. So, agitation for electoral reform accordingly continued, and the great popular movement called Chartism kept England for some 10 years in a state of political unrest, which was still further stimulated by the industrial depression and widespread misery of the hungry voters. Okay. Meanwhile, the progress of science kept pace with the progress of democracy, and in the 50 years with which we are here concerned, men added far more to their positive knowledge of themselves and the universe than their forefathers had done in all the preceding 18 centuries. Nor is this unparalleled increase of knowledge the only point to be considered. In estimating the influence of science upon life and literature, it is further to be remembered that by reason of the spread of popular education, newspapers, magazines, and cheap books, the facts and speculations of the experts were no longer kept to the experts themselves, but passed rapidly into the possession of the reading public at large. This was, for example, the case with the greatest of all modern generalizations, the doctrine of evolutions, which we specially associate with the names of Darwin, Wallace, and Herbert Spencer, and concerning which it is not too much to say that before the Victorian age had closed, it had completely revolutionized all current ideas about nature, man, and society. Okay, so we cannot however get even an approximately complete idea of these social forces unless we bear in mind one important principle of historical interpretation, that every strong movement invariably sets up a counter movement. In our study of the literature of the age of Tennyson, the power of the great counter movement against the domination of science, for example, can never be left out of account. In fact, science affected literature as much by the opposition it created as by its direct influence. It tended to materialism alike in thought and in life, and a great deal that is noblest in Victorian literature was inspired by the desire to check this tendency and to proclaim the eternal value of spiritual things. So when we see talk about Tennyson, he was born in 1809 and he won the Chancellor's Medal at Cambridge in 1829 for poem on Timbuktu. So he became poet laureate in 1850. The extraordinary diversity of his work is itself typical of the strongly marked eclecticism of his age. He wrote on classical, romantic, and modern subjects, and subjects taken from humble and rustic life, on English history and Celtic England, on Celtic legend, on the deepest problems of philosophy and religion, and the range of his method and style is scarcely less remarkable than that of his matter. But even more typical are the content and quality of his poems. His Locksley Hull of 1842 is full of the restless spirit of young England and its faith in science, commerce, and the progress of mankind. While its sequel, Locksley Hall, 60 years after, it shows the revulsion of feeling which had occurred in many minds when the rapid development of science seemed to threaten the very foundations of religion, and commerce was filling the world with the sordid greed of grain. Okay. Then when we talk about Robert Browning, he was born in 1812 and he began to write poetry early. And he began to write his poetry at his very early age. Okay. In contrast with Tennyson, Browning was bold, rugged, and altogether conventional in matter and style, and though never careless in his writings. He was too vehement and too impatient to bestow time and effort upon the polishing of his verse. Much of his work, and especially of his later work, is in consequence prolix and ill digested. It is often also marred by harshness and crudities of expression and by faults in taste. While, despite the heroic attempts of some of his more extravagant admirers to rebut the charge, the obscurity of not a little of his production cannot be denied. But notwithstanding many obvious defects, his greatness as a poet is quite beyond dispute. As a moralist and religious teacher, Browning held a very distinct place among the writers of the Victorian age. An uncompromising foe of scientific materialism, he preached God and immortality as the central truths of his philosophy of life, and he preached them as one absolutely assured of their reality. Then, after Tennyson and Browning, who stand head and shoulders above all their fellows, it is not easy to settle the order of precedence among the many poets of the Victorian age. But the third place may be assigned to Matthew Arnold. Okay, so his most ambitious poems are Sorab and Rustum, Tristram and Isolde, Balder Dead, and Empedocles on Etna. They were written, but carefully wrought as these productions are, they impress us as rather academic, imitative, and unreal. All critical principles, notwithstanding the bias of his genius, was towards the poetry of self-expression, and his best work was done when, ignoring theory, he gave his mind free play. Most of his personal poetry is steeped in the melancholy spirit of an era of transition. Its keynote is struck in these stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse. Okay, the case is different with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Okay, who holds her position as the most considerable and vigorous, if not the greatest of all our women writers of verse. She wrote far too much and too fast. She was singularly deficient in the faculty of self-criticism, and her faults were many and glaring. Her poetry is frequently marked by overwrought emotionalism, which often becomes hysterical and sometimes degenerates into downright gush. She is often spasmodic and even vulgar, and prolixity, diffuseness, straining after effect, and gross abuses in diction and rhyme. Okay, and then the painter poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He was the leading figure in the artistic movement called Free Raphaelitism. Okay, such important poems of him are The Blessed Damozel, Wordsworth, and Ave. Okay, then next we can talk about Christina Georgiana Rossetts. He is the only other woman poet in our literature who can fairly be placed beside Mrs. Browning. Okay, because her work is characterized by deep religious feeling, a pronounced strain of mysticism. Then William Morris, the main line of Rossetti's influence and more broadly of the romanticism represented by him. So Morris' early works are The Defense of Guinevere and Other Poems, The Life and Death of Jason, and The Earthly Paradise. They are purely romantic both in method and style. Okay. Then Sir Henry Taylor. He did most of his work in verse in the dramatic form. He wrote tragedies in the severer Elizabethan manner, of which the best is Philip Van Artevelde, and one romantic comedy, The Virgin Widow or A Sicilian Summer. Then Robert Stephen Harker, the extremely eccentric vicar of Morwenstow in Cornwall. He was a man of curiously medieval cast of mind, and he even shared many of the crudest superstitions of the simple village folk among whom he lived. Okay, then Sidney Dobell, the author of The Roman and Balder, and Alexander Smith, whose life drama gave promises which were never dreamed. Dobell and Smith, they were the examples of exploded reputations. Okay, so James Thomson is likely to gain rather than loss in critical appreciation as times goes on. Okay, then Lord Macaulay, he won fame with his stirring Lays of Ancient Rome, and the versatile Lord Lytton with a romantic epic King Arthur, and the most important Lost Tales of Miletus. Okay, so with this we are coming to the concluding part of the video on the age of Tennyson verse. Hope you're all clear with all the points I have discussed so far. So thank you for